You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And now, here's your host.
Welcome back to the program. I'm Zev Brenner. Very pleased to have with us an award-winning journalist, somebody who you can really call a journalist. And we'll talk about the fact that not everybody that declares themselves to be one today is actually one. Kenneth Timmerman is the author of 11 works of nonfiction, including 2 New York Times bestsellers, 3 published novels. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006 by the former premier of Sweden, and his articles are all over and blogs on his website. But his fascinating new book is called "And the Rest is History: Tales of Hostages, Arms Dealers, Dirty Tricks, and Spies." What a title. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure to be with you, Zev. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. We'll talk about, you have a much, really, you were there in so many different news media around the world, and whether it was CBS or Reader's Digest or 60 Minutes, ABC News, Le Monde, L'Express, Le Point, you were there, you covered, you've seen it all. You were in Beirut, you were in the Middle East and Iraq, other places. Now, when you first started journalism, you were on the left, correct?
I was based in Paris, and the media in France was all on the left with very few exceptions. And when I first went to cover my first war in the Middle East, which was 1982 in Lebanon, I went there as a pro-Palestinian. And I believed the line that I was hearing in not just the French media, but the international media, that here are the poor Palestinians who were the David, and it was Israel, the Goliath. And I was going there to report on Stalingrad, and of course, it turned out just exactly the opposite.
Well, you were there. You thought that you were going to show the world that what the Israelis are up to. You're going to be there defending the Palestinians, and you get there, and they think you're a Jewish spy. What happened?
I get there, and I'd been, I had my Yahoo Jasus. I thought I had my letters of introduction from these Palestinian diplomats in Paris and in Athens, and then I get kidnapped off the street by a Fatah operative, and briefly interrogated and put in an underground cell with 20 other people for 24 days and nights, where we bombed day and night for 24 days.
Now, they thought you were a Israeli spy, correct?
They thought that's the only thing that they said to me. They said, you are an Israeli spy and we're keeping you here. We don't know who you are. You could be an Israeli spy. And after that, they lost, there was no infrastructure. There was no, everybody waited the first couple of days for the quote unquote colonel to come, because the colonel might be an adult in this atmosphere run by kids with Kalashnikovs. And towards the end of the 3.5 weeks there was no colonel, there was no captain, there were no officers. There were just 13-year-olds with Kalashnikovs. And that's when it got truly, truly scary. So,
now, they beat you, correct?
They beat me. And it was after that beating that I had my moment where I felt the presence of Jesus and understood the suffering that he had gone through. And it was 100 times more than what I was going through. And I said, my gosh, you did all that and you did it for me.
I'll tell everyone, so you're an Anglican. And
I'm a born again Christian, but an Orthodox Anglican.
Now, I would assume they probably confused it with Jacobo Timmerman, a Jew who also, right, was arrested and was tortured in Argentina.
Yes, and that was a sorry affair. Many times later, I was confused with him, and people would ask me, "Are you of that family?" I said, "No, my name has 2 M's, and I am not related to a traitor from Argentina who betrayed the state of Israel subsequently. Was rescued by Mossad minutes before he was about to be gunned down by Argentinian secret police." In the late 70s, or I believe it was the late 70s, went to Israel, became an Israeli citizen, and wrote books denouncing the state of Israel and Zionism.
So here you are. You wanted to denounce the state of Israel and Zionism. You went there to that bunker, and you went to Beirut. I shouldn't say the bunker. You ended up in the bunker.
Yeah.
And at what point did you say, "Hey, did I read my cards wrong? Did I get this out of place?" When did you have the awakening?
Yeah, first of all, I was actually in that prison cell itself for my born again experience, and also the experience being there with Palestinians who were taken hostage, with even a Somali in West Beirut. There were Lebanese Christians, there were Lebanese Shia, and they all were telling these horror stories about what the PLO had been doing to them. And I began that it was the entire city of West Beirut that had been taken hostage by the PLO in this conflict. And that was the line that I had been hearing in Paris before I came. The poor Palestinians suffering at the hand of the Israelis. It was the poor Lebanese suffering at the hands of the Palestinians. And that I began to learn while I was already in that prison.
So you're there in your prison. How'd you get out?
By the grace of God and on the wings of angels. And I do not exaggerate. I have no logical explanation for how I got out. As I said earlier, there were no adults left in this underground prison. They were taking people out and shooting them every day. And one day, an adult came in and said, "Are there any French people here?" And there were two other French people I knew were there. One of them had been thrown in the cell with me. He was a foreign legionnaire, somebody who had done bad things to the Palestinians. And I figured, I flipped a coin in my head. I said, okay, either they figured out what this guy had actually done to them, which was plant mines in some of their territories, and he blew up Palestinian guerrilla fighters, or they really are here to get the French people out. And I said, if I stay, I'm going to die anyway. So I'm going to go out, and I'm going to die. I'm going to die out in the light. So I went out with them, and 2 days later, we were ultimately released to the French, and I was considered a French citizen for about 24 hours.
Wow. And why did they tell you why they beat you on the soles of your feet?
Yes, we had a visit by a young couple, a woman and a man, pretending to be journalists, young Americans. I later learned who this woman was. She was the little drummer girl of John le Carre fame. She was squiring an American reporter around, and me and the Frenchman stood at this little Judas. It's a tiny little window in the steel cell door, and we started to whistle the Marseillaise, the French national anthem. And then they didn't flinch, they didn't turn around. So I said, "Hey, they're Americans." We whistled the Star Spangled Banner. The woman freaked out. Her name was Janet Stevens. The woman freaked out and kind of glanced back in our direction. The man caught her hand and said, "Don't look that way. Don't pay any attention to that." And I could see what was going on in their minds. They were saying they're Americans there held hostage in this horrible underground place where they had come to seek refuge during a bombing. So they were there as a bomb shelter. We were there as
Oh,
hostages.
no, so the jail was anybody could walk in.
Yeah. And so she went in, they went down there into a bomb shelter thinking they were going to a bomb shelter. And then they heard that there were hostages there. And I could see in their minds, they were thinking, my goodness, what's the difference between us here as Americans and those people there as Americans? And the answer was a steel door.
And they were able to waltz out of there with no
And they
problem?
waltzed out of there because they were guests of the Palestinians, as I thought I was going to be, but I was a different kind of guest.
So here you are, you're finally get out of this prison by the PLO. What happens next? Where do you go?
Well, I go back to Paris briefly, but then I come back to Israel. I came back to Israel months later. I went to the West Bank, spent quite a bit of time in the West Bank, wanting to see another side of the Palestinians, and I began to realize that this Israel-Palestine conflict was very, very different from what I thought it was. I already began to realize that in Beirut, but I saw it on the ground in Ramallah, in Nablus, and places like that, where young Palestinians would take me out and whisper to me how the PLO was essentially a mafia organization. And they would say this to me. They said, we can't take advantage of these houses that the Israelis want to provide for us in the village leagues. They were creating new villages where Palestinians could leave the refugee camps. They said, we can't ever go there. I said, why not? And they said, shh, we have to take you out. Let's walk out there, out in this open field, and then I'll tell you. Because they would kill us if we took advantage of what the Israelis are offering us.
Well, listen, the Yasser Arafat, the PLO, was against Israeli settlements in Judea and Samaria, but yet when the Palestinian laborers went to work in these settlements, the Yasser Arafat and the PLO was getting a commission, were getting a percentage of the wages. So, they were very wealthy. Even the money today, we don't know what happened with his wife. She has money, they covered it up, and there's corruption going on today. So you try to find a different side to the Palestinians. You didn't find it. Then you traveled. You were also in other parts of the Middle East too, correct?
I was. So I was doing the Palestinian wars in 82, 83, 84. in Syria and also in North Lebanon. I was covering Arafat in Tripoli, Lebanon, a year and a half later after I
And
was
you
his
actually
hostage.
spoke to him. You went there.
I did, but I never kind of wanted to remind him that I had been his guest during the
Oh,
siege of
you
Beirut.
never. I thought you'd raise and say, "Listen, what happened? I love you guys, and you this how you treat me, isn't that?"
Yeah, no, I thought it was probably more diplomatic and a little bit more secure not to remind him of that situation.
But at this point in time, were you still sympathetic to the Palestinians
No,
in writings?
no, not certainly not to the PLO. What I learned, and I've never forgotten this, and I still believe this very strongly, is that when you talk to individuals, things are very, very different. So I became friendly with individual Palestinians. I became friendly with people who were refugees, people living in refugee camp, even Palestinian politicians. I went back to Gaza, for example, in 1999 and interviewed a Palestinian member of parliament who was calling for transparency in their parliament. I said, this guy's a pretty interesting person. And we talked about the Congressional Research Service, and they were going to get help from the CRS in Washington, D.C. And I said, wow, that's a really good thing. Here's what you should ask them. He, of course, was later jailed by Arafat. So I believe in, people are the key. And as a reporter, I didn't go for the big interviews, the prime ministers, the presidents. I preferred to be on the ground doing shoe leather journalism, talking to people who were, that was my original idea going to Beirut, talking to people who are undergoing, who are suffering from the dogs of war. What is their life like? Hearing their stories. So I talked to nurses and to doctors and people like that.
Where's Kenneth R. Timmerman? His fascinating book is called "And the Rest is History: Tales of Hostages, Arms Dealers, Dirty Tricks, and Spies." He also got fired for Time magazine for trying to report a story of President Clinton. We'll talk about that in climate of today's day and age. I thought journalism was dead now, but might have been dead a long time ago, as we hear from our guest, Kenneth R. Timmerman. So you're covering the Middle East, you're covering Arafat, you end up in Iraq. Now, we always led to assume that there are no weapons of mass destruction there, but I'm hearing that there really were mass destruction, but it was covered up.
Yeah, you'll read about that in the book. And I wrote 2 other books about this as well, which go into much, much more detail. I don't try to recap my other books of nonfiction in this memoir. I try to tell the kind of the story behind the story. And the story that I tell in And the Rest in History about Iraq, first of all, is meeting all of the arms dealers, which was a heck of a lot of fun. So I met all these arms dealers in Baghdad. And the thing that people don't realize is that arms dealers love to talk.
They do. I thought they want to be secretive.
They love to talk, but you've just got to know how to talk to them. You've got to not be there with your notepad out and your tape recorder or the rest, and it's better over a bottle of whiskey or a couple of bottles of wine. And in Baghdad in particular, sometimes we had to go out onto balconies or into very, very, very noisy bars because there were listening devices everywhere. So I met just about every arms dealer in Baghdad, wrote a whole bunch of stories about that, and got introduced through that to the heads of the Iraqi chemical weapons programs, the head of the Iraqi ballistic missile programs, and the head of the Iraqi uranium enrichment program. I interviewed these guys in the late 1990s, and I was the only Western journalist ever to do so. And I did it for a defense magazine. So not only do I know there were weapons of mass destruction on the ground, I knew the individuals who were making them.
So how come we were led to believe in the journalism here in America and Europe were saying we went for nothing, there were no weapons of mass destruction? How did this lie get perpetuated?
Well, Bush lied, people died. There are two Gulf Wars. There's 2 wars that the United States fought with Iraq. The first one, 1991, there was a dispute before the war about weapons of mass destruction, but then you had a UN special commission that went in, David Kay, the standoff on the nuclear sites, where they actually found stuff. And they found stuff, and people agreed that they found uranium enrichment programs. As one of my friends put it at the time, we thought, the US intelligence community thought in 1991, before the war, that Saddam Hussein had 1 nuclear weapons program and he was 5 years away. As it turned out, he had 5 nuclear weapons programs, and he was 1 year away.
Wow.
That was in 1991. Later, so the second war under George W. Bush in 2003, the conventional wisdom was, we've disarmed Saddam. He no longer has these capabilities. The UN has destroyed all those factories. and therefore there's no WMD, no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And yet, and here's the kicker, the new head of that UN arms disarmament organization, Hans Blix, a Swede, was telling the world as the war began, he had inspectors in Iraqi missile plants saying, oh yeah, the Iraqis are continuing to produce missiles as we speak today, as American troops are crossing the border from Kuwait into Iraq. Iraq continued to produce missiles that were banned under all of those UN Security Council agreements.
Sounds like can we talk about Iran today, right?
Right.
What do you make heck of that? Our country wants to go back and make a bad deal again with Iran and trust them. And you know the players in the Middle East. What's going on in your professional opinion?
Well, it's a terrible deal. The first one was bad in 2015. This one is even worse because there are fewer guarantees. The Iranians apparently have tried to put up more barriers to verification. They want to make sure that a future Republican president cannot withdraw from the deal again, that there will be some kind of guarantees to Iran that they can continue access to the world oil markets, the world financial markets, and the world technology markets. This is insane. And really the only reason I think, well, Biden has always been pro-Tehran. I covered him in one of his re-election campaigns for the US Senate in the early 2000s, when he was raising money from pro-Tehran lobbyists in Washington, D.C. and speaking at their events. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable. I reported about that at the time in the Washington Times. So he has always been pro-Mullah. Clinton was pro-Mullah. Even Jimmy Carter during the hostage crisis. There's one story that people aren't very familiar with, which I reported at the time. After Desert One, when we failed in the mission to rescue the hostages, April 1980, the head of the French Secret Intelligence Service, Alexandre de Maranche, talked to Carter. He says, Mr. President, I have a solution. He said, oh, do you have a solution for the hostages? He said, yes, I have a solution. We the French, we will go and kidnap the Ayatollah, and then we'll fly him out on a helicopter to your aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf, and then you'll negotiate.
I like it.
and Carter says, oh no, we can't do that. He's a man of God.
Wow. Well, you can't make this stuff up.
No, you can't make this stuff up.
And you're a terrific journalist. I think wasn't the French equivalent of the FBI also wiretapping you and spying on you?
They were, and I put out a tweet kind of pitching this book. I said, sometimes it was harder to work as a reporter in France than in Saddam Hussein's Iraq at times, because I had a minder from the French equivalent of the FBI called the DST. This guy would come in, he'd take me out to lunch every month. And when it started, he said, Mr. Timmerman, you have this newsletter, Middle East Defense News. You're talking about arms sales, about hostages, ransom payments, intelligence, really dark stuff that is very, very sensitive. And we want to know more about your sources. I said, well, I can't tell you about my sources. He said, look, make you a deal. You've got two choices. Either I can take you out for lunch once a month. We'll go out to a nice restaurant. You choose the restaurant. I'll pay for it. Or we can do this another way. And I said, I kind of like French restaurants in Paris, and I know a lot of good ones. Why don't we try it that way? And it was sometimes there were dicey moments, but they would read back to me transcripts of my overseas telephone conversations. If they wanted to put the squeeze on me, they said, well, how come you said to so-and-so 2 weeks ago this? And then they'd read back the transcript just to let you know.
What were they trying to get from you?
They were trying to find out who was feeding me information about arms sales to Iraq and other intelligence issues. And I obviously never provided them anything about that. You've got my telephone conversations. You ought to know that. Of course, I would never speak on the phone to those people.
Our guest is Kenneth Timmerman. He's covered war, espionage, intrigue from major news organizations in U.S. around the world. I'll name drop New York Times, Newsweek, Time Magazine, CBS's 60 Minutes, ABC News, Le Monde, etc. has written a fascinating book. It's called "And the Rest is History: Tales of Hostages, Arms Dealers, Dirty Tricks, and Spies." Now, we're living today, Ken, in an age where the conventional wisdom is that there's no real journalism. It's all serves partisan interests. If it's a Democrat in power, they want to show favoritism to him. If it's a Republican, I guess we assume that the same thing would be happening. So in your opinion, did journalism die now, or did journalism die earlier? Because some of your stories didn't make the light of day, and you were fired for Time magazine as well for covering one story. So are we in a worse situation today, or has it always been there?
Oh, we're in a worse situation today, but it's been going on for quite some time. And I identify the day in my book. I identify the day journalism died in America, and that was in July of 1994. I was working with Time magazine in an investigative unit, looking into a story of selling that the Clinton administration was selling military technology to communist China, and not just anything. They were selling off the production tools in the B-1 bomber plant in Columbus, Ohio. And I got a tip off from the labor union at the time, from the labor union working in the plant. They were very pro-American, very patriotic, and they were disturbed when they saw these Chinese military intelligence goons coming into the plant after midnight. So I worked up the story, found some other examples as well, and we were all set to go, 4 pages in Time magazine. And on the Friday before publication, the editor called me into his office. He said, we're spiking the story. And by the way, you're fired. I said, well, what happened? He said, well, the administration was pissed off. They didn't like your questions. Wait a second, I thought that was my job as a reporter, to ask questions of people in power that might make them a little bit uncomfortable or might challenge the lies that they tell in public. He said, no, these are our people. This is our administration. You're fired. And that was a real awakening to me. I could not conceive of the idea that a senior editor at a news magazine like Time or Newsweek or the New York Times could look at the administration as our administration. Even when I liked George W. Bush in the beginning, especially after 9/11. I worked for the Washington Times, which was a pro-Bush newspaper. We never considered the Bush administration our administration, even though many of us there had friends who worked in the administration. It was still the government. And the government has a tendency to lie or to falsify information. And your job as a journalist is to try to find out the truth. And you do that by asking uncomfortable questions. I was fired for asking those uncomfortable questions. And that's why I think journalism died on that day, when the national media considered a Democrat administration their administration.
What would you say about today? Today, it's the
Yeah, well, today it's even worse. I mean, look, I love it when Tucker Carlson or somebody else on Fox News, they do these montages, and they will pick the same phrase. This was the most secure election, the most secure election, the most secure election in history, and they're going from CNN, MSNBC to ABC, NBC. They're all using the identical talking points. Absolutely unbelievable. This is not journalism. This is the communications directorate of the DNC.
It's not only what they report, where there seems to be a collusion between some of the phrases, some of the stories that get printed, but even the Hunter Biden story, which finally got out, the New York Times and other media, but during the course of the election, that was repressed by not only the major media, but also by some of the social media outputs.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It came out in the New York Post. And now we have learned that Mark Zuckerberg revealed last week that the FBI came to people at Facebook and said, watch out for Russian disinformation. And he said this in the context of the Hunter Biden story. And they throttled reporting on it, Twitter banned it completely. And they took the New York Post down from Twitter for weeks, until after the election, I believe. For weeks, they took them off of Twitter. So they censored the information. And we had polls after the election that said, clearly, among Democrats, something like 15% to 20% of Democrats said they would not have voted for Biden if they had known about the Hunter Biden story and the Hunter Biden scandals.
So have we become so politicized? Because if you speak to the media, they're going to tell you they're not biased and not politicized, but from what it seems like, they do toe the party line.
Yeah, it reminds me of Dan Rather many years ago before he was disgraced and hounded out of CBS News when he was asked, what is a middle of the road newspaper? You read a lot from the left and the right. What's a middle of the road, a straight shooting newspaper? Oh, the New York Times.
Is there any journalists around today that are not afraid to tell the story the way it is and tell the truth, whether it be right or left, but they'll just do what's honest? Is there such an animal in the United States today?
I think there are some, and I think the good news is I think that there are younger journalists who are being trained by places like the Leadership Institute or the Journalism Center run by Young America's Foundation, conservatives, but they're being trained to think critically and to not to take government propaganda literally. I mean, the what we used to call the mainstream media, the legacy media, if you prefer, is essentially reading press releases from the government as if it were news. This is not news. Karine Jean-Pierre is not giving news in her daily briefings, and she's hardly even giving spin. She's just reading the most absurd press releases that press shop has cooked up inside the White House. I mean, some of the stuff she comes out with is just unbelievable, and the media swallows it.
Yeah, so what's the solution? Is there one? That can we get back to good old-fashioned honest reporting where no matter where the story takes us, they'll go? Is that possible? Is that something which is in the works? Or how can we get there again?
Well, look, I think this is a generational issue. I think we have lost reliable reporting for a good generation. And now it's up to each of us as citizens to basically do a triage, to go through the various sources of reporting that you find and to learn to pay attention to people's bylines. Learn to find reporters that you trust in places that you trust, whether it's a Miranda Devine at the New York Post or someplace else, and read people's bylines and get used to search out the truth for yourself in reliable places.
What are you up to these days? You still involved in any aspect of journalism?
Well, what I speak a lot around the country, and I don't introduce myself as a journalist any longer. I said, I used to call myself a journalist when it was an honorable profession. And of course, that gets everybody to laugh because clearly it no longer is. I'm an author. I also work in my day job these days. Besides writing these memoirs, I've got 2 more books of this memoir to come out. One on France, which is kind of a travel book, but a second one called The Iran House, which tracks my efforts to overthrow the regime in Tehran with Iranian opposition groups and also some people in the Israeli government. A lot of, until now, secret stories, obviously a failure because the regime is still there in Tehran, as deadly as ever. But I work with victims of 9/11 to recover on an enormous judgment against the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran. We have lawsuits all over the world. And I brought Iranian defectors to the table because I work a lot with Iranian defectors and interview them and debrief them and try to corroborate their information. So I'm there trying to help American victims of the Iranian regime recover on these judgments, get money from the government of Iran.
Now, you were in Lebanon, you were in Iraq. Which other Arab countries did you operate in?
I've been in Libya. I was the first American civilian allowed into Libya when they reopened the doors in 2004, met Gaddafi there. I've been obviously in Israel, the West Bank, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. I mean, all over the region, the UAE, recently in the Republic of Georgia, trying to defend one of these Iranian defectors who's been framed by Georgian intelligence in Tbilisi, Georgia. But I travel a little bit less these days. I've spent probably the last 10 years trying to help Christians in northern Iraq and in Amman, Jordan, people especially who had worked for U.S. Special Forces. I wrote
Afghanistan, did you spend time in Afghanistan too?
Afghanistan, I could never get into Afghanistan when I wanted to. I was supposed to get in February of 1998. I was going there for Reader's Digest to interview Osama bin Laden, and he didn't want to talk to anybody at that time. Later, we learned he was in a shooting war with his rivals inside Al-Qaeda.
Wow. So you read had such an interesting life, been to so many interesting places. Now, before I let you go, you mentioned that you're fighting for Christians. The untold story is how the Christians, Arabs, have been driven out of the Middle East, from the Palestinian areas, from Lebanon, from Syria. Nobody talks about it, and I wish they would, because that's a separate story. It's not just oppression against Jews, which is the high on their list, but also Christians are being persecuted.
Absolutely right. And they're being persecuted on religious grounds by jihadi Muslims. The Palestinians do two things. First, they drive Christians out. And then the Christians who remain in places like Bethlehem, they colonize them. And they make them basically obedient to the regime. And so they no longer really are behaving so much as Christians, they're behaving as Palestinian puppets. But in Iraq, there were 1.5 million Christians when Saddam left power, was forced out of power in 2003. There may be 150,000 to 200,000 now, 1/10 the population. And so I've spent a lot of time in northern Iraq with these refugees, internal displaced persons, but and have followed them to other countries, in Jordan and Lebanon in particular, trying to help them on aid missions. And it's just, these are stories that break your heart. I tell them in a novel. I tried to write a nonfiction book about it. My publishers in New York had no interest. It was called Blood of the Martyrs. So I wrote a novel about it called ISIS Begins. And it's a fiction told from the point of view of an Iraqi Christian interpreter in northern Iraq being hunted down by jihadi Muslims, and kind of tells those on the ground stories.
Wow, fascinating. We got to have you back again. Certainly covered a lot of ground. Now, you went from being a liberal to today you're a Republican, right? You're writing the book about your conversion to being a Republican.
That's right. That's in the book, and the rest is history. How I go from a left bank liberal pro-Palestinian fellow traveler to a born-again Christian Zionist conservative.
Who also worked for the Wiesenthal Center.
Who also worked for the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and the associate dean from the Simon Wiesenthal Center, Rabbi Cooper, wrote the foreword to my book,
which I recommend. And the rest is history: tales of hostage arms dealers, dirty tricks, and spies. Fascinating book. I recommend it. Will there be a movie on this book?
Rabbi Cooper and I have actually discussed that. I've talked about that years ago. He says, Ken, it's your story. Your story is the movie. I was talking about doing another movie. He said, no, but it's your story that's the movie. I've never pitched it. We'll have to see what happens.
If there was a movie, is there anybody that you'd like to portray as Kenneth Timmerman as yourself?
I've never thought about that. I've really never thought about that. I'm not such a big fan of Hollywood these days, but I'm sure there is.
Anyway, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Zev. It's my pleasure. It's been
Thanks
fun.
for listening.
For continuous Jewish programs, TalklineNetwork.com, or our 24-hour-a-day listen line at 641-741-0389. For past shows, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, Instagram, and all major podcast platforms, or jewishpodcast.org. Thanks for listening to the TalklineNetwork.com. Past shows, you can find us on iTunes.